Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session. I hope you've had a really good morning so far. Just for a few introductions, my name is Anna Woolman, and I've been invited by the Communicate team to host this session on harnessing employee and volunteer activism. In my day job, I'm a science engagement and communications specialist, focusing on a broad range of environmental science topics and creating a culture amongst environmental scientists of communicating their research. I was fortunate to be able to join the in-person event in Bristol yesterday, and being around so many passionate people has been incredibly enlivening. And thanks to this, I already feel pretty fired up about trying to create a more positive change. So it feels very apt to be challenging some of that energy into today's session on employee activism with Professor Megan Reitz. And Megan, is it Reitz? I've pronounced that correctly?
Do you know, it is actually Reitz,
Right,
but it gets pronounced in all manner of different ways, so it's totally fine.
Megan Reitz. I should have checked that beforehand, I have to say. Sorry about that. So Megan is Professor of Leadership and Dialogue at Hult International Business School, focusing on how we create the conditions for transformative conversations at work. Her most recent book with Financial Times Publishing is called Speak Up, which was shortlisted for the CMI Management Book of the Year 2020. Oh, and her TED Talk on employee activism has been viewed more than 1 million times, which is really impressive and well worth a watch if you haven't already seen it. So today we'll be hearing from Megan about her thoughts on what employees want from their organisations and how leaders in the environmental sector can rise to the challenge of building proactive and productive organisations. But before I hand over to Megan, I will just clarify how we're going to do the Q&A. So there will be a chance for a question and answer session at the end. But any questions that you have, please put them in the Q&A function and I will relay them to Megan. If you want to put the question in the chat, don't, because we won't see it. But Megan throughout the session will be asking you some questions yourself and asking you to put some replies in the chat. So when she asks you to do that, please do get involved. So without further ado, Megan, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Anna. Hello, everybody. Lovely that you're joining me today. And we're going to talk about employee activism. The first thing I wanted to say is set that topic in the broad context of what I'm interested in and research. I'm basically interested in your habits, okay? Not all of those habits. I'm interested in habits that you have around when you speak up and when you decide not to, and the habits that you have around when you listen and who you listen to, and when and who you don't. So those habits around what gets said and who gets heard, they define our lives, essentially. They define our relationships at home and at work. They define our careers. They define our leadership practice. So my research over the last kind of 10 years in particular has been with a project called Speaking Truth to Power. And I've been investigating with my co-researcher and author, John Higgins, what do we talk about in organizations, in the workplace? What don't we talk about? What's easy to talk about? What's more tricky to talk about? How is that changing? And seriously, whose voices do we really listen to? And what are the consequences of that? And of course, you know, how do you start to disrupt some of those habits? Because we have habits that have huge consequences on us and the people around us. Our teams create habits around what gets talked about and who gets heard. And our organizations create habits. You might call it culture around what gets talked about and what doesn't. So it's within that setting that John and I started to really explore a sort of a change that we saw in organizational conversations. And that's around employee activism. And we started looking at that about 5 years ago now. And I'm going to talk for like about 20 minutes and just share some of the really key messages from that piece of research. And then we're going to open it up. So I really, really would love you to put as many questions as you can in. I am also going to ask you to to put some stuff in the chat function. And just to put out there that if, my research is on speaking up. So if nobody says a word over the next 20 minutes, I may cry. Okay, so I'm just putting that out there. Get ready with the keyboard, and I would love you to engage. I know we have listening habits on these webinars as well, don't we? Like, some of you have kind of cleared the decks and you have your notepad and pencil ready, and some of you are kind of like, well, this ear is sort of pointing in that direction and the other kind of pointing towards the emails or whatever else is going on. But I would love you to wholeheartedly engage on the chat and also the Q&A here. And let's talk about this topic called activism. And I'm going to share you this. I've only got one slide, and this is it. It's got 8 kind of key points that we found in our research. And the very first one is activism is in the eye of the beholder. Now, when I say the word activist, could you just go to the chat function now and just tell me, what are the words and the images and the emotions that come to you when you consider the word activist? Okay, so please just put a few words. Yeah, placards. Do you know, Matt? That is literally the main image that came up in our research. And we interviewed hundreds of people, and people that have a picture of that, placard out on the street. Angry, strong, passion, hope, power, fierce, brave, hippie, love it. All sorts of things there. And the topics that also come to your minds. And there's a range of words there, isn't there? There's kind of everything from sort of selfless to loud to disruption to, raising fists, being aware, bravery, exasperation, courage. Wow, brilliant. So we did ask, actually thousands and thousands we've asked. I've surveyed overall on Speaking Truth to Power, I've surveyed about 19,000 employees globally. On activism, it's probably around about 11,000. And literally the words are everything from, courage and passion and change, right the way through to, self-indulgent, violent, all those sorts of words as well, and everything in between. Okay, so activism is a loaded word. I would suggest it's becoming kind of more controversial as a word rather than less controversial. And one of the things we wanted to point out in our research, first off, is that if you are in an organization, and particularly if you are managing or you have employee activists, including yourself, in the organization, you'd better figure out pretty quickly what judgments and assumptions and, frankly, baggage that you might come with when you consider the word activist and when you consider the particular topic that's on the agenda. And it's remarkable how many conversations I've seen happen and been part of in management teams where people haven't just first paused and said, actually, I've got a story about this issue. I'm coming into this conversation with a pile of images and emotions, positive or negative, that's clearly going to impact how I think we should respond to this situation. So the word activist isn't necessarily helpful. It sometimes is helpful. In some parts of the world, in some topics, being an activist is really cool. And it's an identity that we wear. And in other parts of the world, as you will be aware, being an activist is life-threatening. And so we have to have a kind of an understanding of what language do we use around this and what do we bring to the table. I interviewed, one of the many people I interviewed was Ruchika Tulsian, who is an amazing author and researcher. And she said, wonderful quote, she said, well, what looks like rebellion to you might be another person's basic human rights. So of course we view behavior and we view topics very, very differently. And one of the first things we need to do is just, before we try and figure out responses, is, well, what's our collective experience here? And can we individually as well become aware of the sort of judgments and assumptions we're bringing in? In our research, we defined activism as voices of difference that speak up and seek to influence on a range of social and environmental issues, and that challenge the status quo. And they also disrupt power dynamics, which is something I'm really interested in, and I'm going to come on to next. So that's the first point, is like, what does activism mean to you? What does it mean to your colleagues? Have you had that kind of conversation? Really important. The second one, people in perceived positions of power. So, maybe leaders, maybe managers, maybe other people of perceived positions of power in the organization are often in what I call an optimism bubble. Now, this is kind of one of the key points I'll explain. So I'm going to spend a bit longer on this one. So Anna, don't panic if, I'm spending loads of time here. I will get to the end. I'd like to talk to you about titles and labels. Okay, so Anna did a lovely introduction to me just a couple of minutes ago, and there was a few titles and labels about TED Talks and professor and things like that. And then I popped up on your screen and you looked at my little picture, and then you will have given me some more labels and titles. So you may not have been conscious of doing that, but you will have looked at me and you'll have gone, okay, female, white, British. You will have labeled me on my age, probably, might still be doing that, won't go there, and my appearance, and you might be labeling me on literally my background. We label and title one another all the time, okay? And these are very, very interesting because they convey different levels of status and authority, depending on the context. So the same label can mean very different things in different contexts. Activist, for example. In some contexts, that might mean high status, high levels of authority. In other contexts, maybe not so much. Now, when we have labels that are high status, we often don't notice the impact that those labels have on other people's voices. When we have lower status labels in that particular setting, so when we don't have the right labels, it's far more obvious. We can kind of sit there and go, wow, it makes a difference around here if you're that, and that. Okay. If you are that, and that, it's not so obvious. And we can go in what I call an optimism bubble. Okay. Where another term we use is advantage blindness. We can be blind to our own advantage. And what that means, definitely looking at the data that we've collected on these, 19,000 employees, you are far more likely to overestimate the degree to which people are speaking up around you. So you'll think that you're hearing what you need to hear. Okay. You will also overestimate how approachable you are and your listening skills. In fact, we all overestimate our listening skills. Okay. So what it means in our organizational settings is that we can have leaders and managers almost inevitably that think they're hearing what matters and think that they're approachable, but their behavior isn't actually sending that message to the people that are around them in the way that they think that it is. Okay, so we tend to be detached, and what that means is we can be a bit taken by surprise when activist voices suddenly kind of reach us. Perhaps they've gone external and through social media because they haven't reached us internally, and we kind of go, what? Hang on a second, I thought I knew what was going on here. So that's the second point. We have to, when we're particularly in areas when we're in positions of power, we have to really pay attention to whether we can connect into what really matters in our organizations. Okay, so that's on the listening side as well. The point number 3 is you can't sit on the activism fence. So a quick point here, in times gone by, organizations and leaders have got away with being able to say, we're neutral. Yeah, we're going to keep out of this one. And that isn't the case anymore. So it is as political to sit on the fence as it is to get off it. It is as risky to speak up as it is to stay silent. And so we need to be talking about the consequences of staying silent on matters as well as speaking up, because staying silent is obviously political. It is also making a political point. Does that mean that you and your organization needs to speak up about everything? No, of course not. You can't. But it does mean that your choices, need to be fairly carefully done. And you do need to consider the impact of silence as well as the impact of advocacy. And when we studied how leaders and managers respond, we formulated this kind of spectrum of responses. So it goes from, this is number 4 here, it goes from non-existent, which is when an issue just really seriously isn't anywhere on the agenda, through to suppression. That's another reaction that we've seen where, again, leaders might go, okay, we're not talking about that. They might say that explicitly, or it may become really obvious that if you speak up about that, you tend to disappear fairly quickly. That's suppression. Facadism is we'll say all the right things, but we won't actually do anything. It's a facade. Then we've got defensive engagement, otherwise known as let's do what the lawyers tell us we have to. So we'll kind of, okay, we'll engage in gender or issues, or we'll engage in climate issues, but we'll kind of do what we really have to, and no more than that. Then there's a really interesting step change to dialogue. And this is a lovely and interesting word as well, because we use the word dialogue a lot. And I think that sometimes when we use that, people are kind of meaning a nice chat, cup of tea, we're having a dialogue, we're in dialogue. My experience of dialogue is that it's really messy and risky, and there's fallout, and you'll never get everybody to agree. So forget about consensus. That's kind of dialogue. Dialogue is about sharing information and sharing decision-making. That's where it gets tricky, particularly for leadership teams. So what does dialogue on race mean in organizations? Well, it means, we do need to share information. We need to listen to stuff that we're not aware of and we're not comfortable with. We need to go to new territory. And in that process, we'll probably mess up and we'll be clumsy. That's another thing that doesn't fit with our view of leadership and management either. We have a ridiculously positive impression of what, a leader means, and we don't make mistakes. Well, if you're going into dialogic engagement, you will. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we create the space for that? So that's dialogue. And then there are the organizations, in the poster organizations of Ben & Jerry and Patagonia that stimulate activism. So they have an identity as activist organizations. So I wonder, I'd love you to think right now, where, if you're in an organization of sorts, what do you think the response of your organization is to activist voices? And of course, many of you on this might be in that, being part of an organization that is an activist, takes an activist identity around a certain issue. But of course, activist organizations in one area may find it very difficult to talk about other activist areas in different social and environmental capacities, and that's quite interesting too. So how do we understand our response? And by the way, linking back to number 2 there about this optimism bubble, guess what? The more, and the labels that I've particularly examined are to do with hierarchy gender, and ethnicity in the data set that we have, the more senior white male you are, which are three, not always, but they are three titles and labels that tend to be viewed with higher status and authority, the more senior white male you are, the more likely you are to think you're in dialogue. Whereas if you go to others, they are more likely to kind of go, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure I call that dialogue. So again, there's that element of the chance of being surprised in that. So you need to know, how do others view the reaction, the response that you have? Okay. Number 5 is just a message, to do with our wider research on speaking truth to power. How we respond with activist voices is usually a really interesting indication of what an organization's real speak up culture is like. So, for example, I work with lots of organizations right now that have speak up initiatives running of one sort and the other. And, it's in the activist conversations that the rubber hits the road. It's in those conversations where, you really test. Okay, you want people to speak up. Should we just test that? And is it that you want them to speak up as long as they don't disrupt the power dynamic? Is it that you want people to speak up as long as it has to do with the profit of the organization? So it tests those boundaries in a really fascinating way. Now let's get on to activists themselves. That's kind of more of the research around leaders and managers. Activism, number 6, activism might be tempered or radical. I love the work of 2 academics called Mayerson and Scully, and they came up with a brilliant term, which is the tempered radical. So whether you class yourself as an activist, more of that in a second, or not, anybody that wants to instigate change in a system has some choices about how they go about that. Now, you have to be radical in the sense that you've got to do something that's counter to the status quo by definition, otherwise nothing changes. Okay, so you've got to be radical. If you're too radical, the system won't cope with you. It will spit you out. So you temper it down a bit. But of course, if you do that too much, the system won't even notice you and you won't make any change at all. So one of the most interesting parts that we have to navigate as activists is, how radical should we be? When do we kind of step at that point where the system can't hear me now because it is just on defense? Defensiveness has kicked in and I'm likely to be exited completely. And that is, I can't give you a right answer there, but that is a constant reflective learning process of, how am I pushing the limits? How much more can I push here and how? And do I have the people around me that can kind of tell me that and indicate that? So number 7, activism can be done skillfully and sustainably, but we didn't interview, I don't think we interviewed a single activist that at some point hadn't fallen over. When you are the person chipping away at the status quo, it's exhausting. And we need to pay attention to that. Of course, it's exhausting because you're doing this path that I've just been speaking about. Now, we asked activists, what's the most important capacities for effective change, effective activism? Number 1 capacity, when we coded it all, was a bit of a surprise, although it shouldn't have been at all. The number 1 important skill for an activist, listening. Not advocacy. We kind of think about activism in relation to advocacy, but it was resoundingly clear in our research that the activists are saying, you've got to be able to really listen. Even when you passionately disagree with something, we have to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the system that we're in. Really be curious, really be interested. Because if we can't do that, then we can't speak to the system. We can't figure out how to navigate it skillfully. And you can't do that kind of half listening thing where you're like, yeah, I know what you're going to say. Yeah, you're wrong. that doesn't really do it. So that was really important. Political awareness. So who has what power and what's really on people's agendas, and how do I kind of get myself on it? That came up a lot. Alliances, not being a lone voice. This is true of our wider research as well. It's risky being an individual and putting up your hand, as well as exhausting. So how do you form alliances and support networks? Because that is so vital. And then the other thing is, how do you pay attention to yourself and your own resilience and what you need to say, to stay strong in that sort of position? And can you accept the fact that sometimes you'll be able to make a stand and feel very energetic, and sometimes actually, you know what, you might just have to stop for a bit, and you might just have to kind of go, I need a rest. How are you with that? Okay. And the final one. Now, this is kind of my wider research on leadership here. I am really interested in whether we are or might begin to see leadership as activism. So how does our understanding of what leadership means start to change, given the different sorts of conversations that we have in our organization and the different way we see organizations' role in society and the environment? So again, back in the mists of time, we've kind of seen businesses and corporations as kind of separate and focused on shareholder value. Now that's thankfully been really challenged. So I think that's still leaving us in this space and leaders in the space of like, okay, I get that the shareholder value bit isn't right, but so what the hell, what is my role here? What's the organization's role in social and environmental issues? And I think we're in a fascinating space around that. So I'll leave you and pass back over to Anna with the kind of idea of, what does this mean for leadership? Will we start to associate activism with leadership? And then, this final conclusion is that I don't think employee activism is going to go away. I hope it won't. It will be a defining feature of the workplace. And I'd like to leave you with the question of, how does the activist label sit with you? How comfortable are you with that label? Why and why not? Okay, and what does that mean for the way that you'll lead going forward? Just these are some resources that we have in terms of finding out more. The thing in the middle is the research report. If you're a Brené Brown fan, we did a podcast with her on employee activism. Haven't actually even got TED on this thing, but there is a TED talk on employee activism that Anna mentioned as well. And there's my contact details if you want to drop me a line after this, because I realize we won't get to all of the questions. With that, I hope you've put in some questions, is all I can say. And if you haven't, quick, please. Otherwise, we'll engage with the chat. Right, I'll stop sharing. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, that was great and really, really insightful as well. I mean, I do have a few things in mind that were coming up when you were speaking, but I will let the audience speak before I bring it to you. So we do have a question in the chat. So this is from Anjali. So I would love it if Megan could expand more upon the relationship between organizations opting for a political neutrality and needing political awareness and strategy for trying to initiate and implement policy change.
Wow.
Yeah, big question there, right?
I may not translate that question correctly in what I'm about to say, in which case, huge apologies, and please just contact me and I will get my thoughts together. If you mean, are there some organizations that are, have to take a political, big P, neutrality position on issues, rather than speak up, publicly around them. If that's what you're referring to, absolutely. There are some organizations, and I've interviewed people from them, that specifically have to have a neutral role in conflict, for example, but also in other systems, civil service systems, and things like that. So I have done some research alongside that, but in most of the situations that I'm working in that kind of neutrality is quite difficult to defend. It really is. And of course, in America, I mean, I'm mainly talking about the UK, but in the US, political activism takes on a whole new kind of meaning and territory, of course, when there's donations and things involved. And so that's much more, that's quite a different scenario over there. So I'm not sure I've answered that, Anna. Do you think I've answered that?
I think you have, and Anjali said that's exactly what she meant. So I think you've covered that well. Thank you. So we've got another Q&A in the chat or Q, you're the A, from Jennifer. So what comes first? A safe space for dialogue, knowing you have allies, or the activism standalone actions, hoping allies comes along down the line?
Right. That's like, which comes first, the chicken or egg, isn't it, really? I think it depends on the system that you're in. It is possible to be a voice, an individual activist voice in a system, and navigate that kind of like, right, I'm going to use my voice, and I will use my voice, and then I will spot who in the system I can then connect with and who is likely to support me. And then in other systems, it would just be really dangerous to speak up, actually, as a lone voice. And so there's more sort of clandestine, right, who's with me here? Can we speak up collectively? Because it just simply wouldn't work to be a lone voice. So I think I've seen sort of both scenarios, but they both certainly come very close together. The use of our voice, but the necessity of allies and people that support us and people that really challenge us, but in a supportive manner. They kind of say, by the way, can I just tell you your blind spots when you're speaking up? That's kind of, again, allies aren't just the people that wildly agree with what we're saying. Allies are the people that want to see us succeed, and will tell us some of the difficult stuff that we wouldn't hear otherwise. So that's a few thoughts on that one.
I also think that's a really good kind of simple definition of allyship as well, and something for us to all remember is that, it isn't necessarily about agreeing, it's about getting people to succeed and challenging people in that way with the view they will succeed because of that. So that's a really thank you, Jennifer, for your question. So we've got another one from Anonymous. So I loved the point on facade communication, Megan. I see this a lot, which is frustrating when a lot of us work in organizations where we're trying to incite real change through being authentic. How can we try to bring more authenticity from the top down in organizations?
This is just such a big question, and I work with so many people that are fed up with the tick box, initiatives and saying the blah blah blah. There are a number of things that we can do. So we can work on how we speak up. Okay, so there's usually stuff that we can do that will help to influence more. We can, in particular, it's the really understanding what's causing leaders, the leadership team, to behave in the way that they currently are. What is forefront for them, and how can we kind of connect the dots, if at all possible, there. It's figuring out whether we have spaces and times in our organizational settings where we can sit and pause and reflect. That's my research right now, because I do work, predominantly I work with leadership teams who, excuse my French, do give a shit. They do want to have a positive impact. But day to day, they've just got quarterly results like right there in front of their heads. They cannot think of anything apart from the task and can barely cope. That's what I'm seeing a lot. I refer to the fact that many of our organizations seem pathologically busy. And in that environment, people don't have space to kind of go, oh, hang on a second. Yes, let's do something here. This is actually really important. Let's reflect on this. So it's a really tricky one. So please watch this space, so to speak, because I'm researching it right now. How do we kind of clear spaces where we can enable people, particularly people in positions of power, to figure out how they can actually respond, and to really engage in that process despite this kind of narrative that's so full. So there are a number of things, and there are definitely things that you can do in terms of collective voice. And of course, we're talking about employee activism, but there is also consumer activism, there's shareholder activism, there's who do the leadership team listen to? It's really valuable to try and think about that internally and externally. And then how does what you need to influence connect into that? There's so much to say on that, but I have got quite a lot of resources that go into some specifics on all of those things. So do look those up.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this gave me a lot of thoughts as well from this question. And I guess, I don't know if you have any thoughts, Megan, on, I mean, sometimes your values and what you think is important just do not match up with your workplaces. Yeah. And in that instance, there's not always a lot you can do, and you can just run yourself into the ground trying to make change and just become, completely exhausted and disheartened. What do you have any insights into that, or any tips for maybe some employees who are working in organizations that just do not match up? Is it time to just leave?
Consider leaving. Yeah. However, not everybody's in the position to do that. Many of us do stay where we are because we catastrophize about the prospects of moving elsewhere, and we think things are more impossible than they actually are. But I am not somebody that would say, keep going in all circumstances, because I've been in organizations that are either toxic or they're just not at that point where they are going to be actively doing work. And it is relevant for any activist to think, well, where can I do my best work here? And sometimes it's kind of, actually, I am not the person. This is not the organization right now, but I bet I could do work elsewhere. So, and I recognize not everybody is in the fortunate position of feeling that they have those sorts of choices. But it's worth kind of considering that, I think.
Thanks, Megan. So we've got a question from Sarah, or Sarah, I'm sure. Sorry, I don't know what way that is pronounced, but can you suggest resources, toolkits, exercises, papers on how to train ourselves and our staff to listen to others and ourselves effectively without cheating ourselves and the others, also on going out the defined path in a constructive way, maybe not so clear?
Okay.
So first bit is around toolkits, exercise and papers on how to train ourselves and our staff to listen to others effectively.
Yes. I have a bit of a sigh here, because of course there's loads of things and toolkits and things. Unless underneath that we have a real curiosity, and then unless we start changing our systems so that we create the spaces where we feel we can actually listen, and unless we stop addictively distracting ourselves with 3 million other things that take us away from listening, toolkits are limited. I also think one of the things that we need, so there's so many I could say, so many things I could say here. And I have got, again, the book in particular, Speak Up. It might be called Speak Up, but half the book is about listening, okay? Because speaking up is relational. So I look at listening a lot. So do go there. Two things that I would say is we have to think about whose opinions we trust and value. And that's often intimately tied up in our perceptions of power and status and authority. So whose voices count and whose voices don't. So that, if we can disrupt that, it means that we can potentially listen at a deeper level. And the other thing I would say is sometimes our listening is improved depending on the questions that we ask. So how can we take responsibility for hearing what we need to hear, and do that by asking really, really skillful questions that enable voice. And then we're listening. We're not just listening to what comes out, we're helping people to voice. And that's a kind of different level of listening. Okay, so yeah, something in there. It is a hugely important capacity for us.
And also very dependent on the context of what are you listening about? I mean, what are you trying to create a dialogue with? And really about the audience. It's all about the audience. Let's communicate.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. So we do have 4 minutes left, so I'll go through a few. Let's try and get through all 3 remaining questions in that time. So the next one is, do you have any suggestions for starter resources for activism or campaigning? I guess just broadly.
Go have a look at the research report. So if you go to my website, meganreitz.com, have a look on that as a first off. And then and maybe give me a contact as well, link in with me or something like that, and I can kind of direct you where from there. But that has some interesting key things that are key skills for activists, and they're also asking you to reflect a bit on how you support yourself whilst you're an activist. So I think that's a good place to start.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so second to last question is from Jen. So I think possibly a lot of us here are not part of the senior leadership in our organizations, and would love to know how we can take feedback from this session to our leadership teams in a way that is sympathetic to challenges they face, including as the ones that are often facing public criticism.
Okay, again, could do a very long answer to that. No, I don't have time. In the book, Speak Up, we talk about 5 W's of speaking up. So who do you need to speak to? Who's the best person, rather than the leadership team? Who is the person that is most likely to hear you on that leadership team? And why? So what's important to them? What's on their agenda? Okay. Where and when do you want to have a conversation? Do you want to speak up? Because environment and timing really matters. And what language, body language, but also verbal language will you use? And in a big part here is I talk a lot about trigger words. So which are words that either you should definitely use because it links with the agenda of the person that you want to hear you, or you should definitely not use because it will put them off entirely. Activism is one of those words that could work really well or really badly. Okay. So it's kind of thinking about how you frame it, where you frame it, and who you frame it to. And on some occasions, maybe you're not the best person to raise it, but somebody that they listen to would be. Okay. So lots of kind of techniques on how to raise issues.
Great, thank you. And the role of allies is obviously extremely important in that instance.
Yes.
So build your crew. So we've got 1 minute left, and a similar question around leadership. So if we're not the leadership but find dealing with our often white male leaders challenging, and recognize the not listening while they're thinking they're approachable thing, any tips for helping them to self-reflect at all? Does it come back to the use or?
Yeah, again, I probably would go back to who is around that team that they listen to that might be able to give them feedback on blind spots. Data often really helps. So I often come in as an external, and of course I can say stuff that people internally sometimes can't. And I literally show them data that says, this is what you think, this is what everybody else thinks. And I do it with a twinkle in my eye so that we don't get kind of a defensive response. And I talk a lot about labels and titles as opposed to privilege or discrimination or other words that, again, can build up quite a lot of a defensive response. So there's a much bigger response needed to that question because it's quite a big one. But please, again, link in, do look at the resources that I've got up there, and I hope something there will help.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. And with that, we are actually 1 minute over. So I will leave this now. Please join me in thanking Megan for her excellent talk and for answering all your questions so well. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.